You don't harbor on the negativity. You always still wish them well. Leave them in a good way. Don't carry the hardship. And that was my mom. I come with her to problems and she said, just let it go. Don't carry that. So as a woman, and the way I am now as a mother, it's like, okay, as long as I watch my actions and do well, other people can have different perceptions and different beliefs or different attitudes. We can't control that. It is what it is, as long as we do our own in a good way.
Hi, folks. This is Encounter Culture, a podcast from the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm Charlotte Jusinski.
And I am Stephanie Padilla.
If you're joining Encounter Culture for the first time, we encourage you to go back one episode and start there for the full story. Then meet us right back here to keep going. To celebrate this season's collaboration, we'd like to thank you for being part of our listening community at Encounter Culture. Over the past 3 seasons of the show, we've toured New Mexico's exceptional state museums and historic sites. But of course, our favorite way to fully experience everything they have to offer is in person with the New Mexico Culture Pass. Right now, through August 31st, 2023, you can enter to win a package of 4 Culture Passes and a 1-year subscription to El Palacio magazine, all valued at $145 by visiting podcast.nmculture.org/giveaway. Whether you're a local resident or you're visiting us on your travels, Culture Pass is your ticket to each of our 15 museums and historic sites. You must be 18 years or older to apply, and there is no purchase necessary. This opportunity is made possible by the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs and the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. Once again, visit podcast.nmculture.org/giveaway and enter to win 4 Culture Passes and a 1-year subscription to El Palacio magazine. Giveaway ends August 31st, 2023.
In this episode, we learn how Miguel Trujillo's life not only left a deep imprint on his community, but on his family as well. Here's a more intimate oral history of who Miguel was as a husband, father, and grandfather.
My life has involved so much around him and my grandma that now as I become a grandparent, I feel more intertwined of what I'm doing with my grandchildren to the teachings that he's done with me.
This is Karen Waconda, Miguel Trujillo's granddaughter.
I have been initiated healer, so that started way back with my grandfather and my grandmother in preparation of herbs and plants and flowers and minerals, and so I was able to receive teachings from them early on.
So, for how much of your life did you know your grandparents?
Well, when he passed, I was 27. I believe. So I knew him quite a bit in my childhood and becoming an adult, and followed, very closely with him. Going to school, college, definitely changed my route of where I went was because of my grandpa. And, he had a stroke. And so going to New Mexico State, I purposely transferred to UNM after a family meeting. I didn't want him to be in a facility, so I made sure I was very close to him and my grandparents. And, I was very lonely. They would give me 10 cents, in a letter and say, call. And I would try to call them once a week in the weekend. And I just missed them so much.
So was it your grandma and your grandpa that were involved with the traditional healings, or was it more your grandmother or your grandfather?
Well, actually, both. They knew about traditional healing. However, in their era, it was to make sure we had an education, and that's what they pushed. And then it was my father, John Waconda, that reintroduced traditional healing and made sure that we understood and had those teachings. And because of that, then it allowed an avenue for my grandfather and my grandmother to come in and teach me. However, even before that, I didn't realize what they were teaching me in my early years. Like my grandfather was the first one to introduce me to minerals. I always had an interest in collection, and I would get allowance. And through them, I would be writing letters to the mines, and I would have my grandfather and my grandmother proofread the letters to mines in Tanzania or, opals in Australia, and say, I'm attaching this money and I'm interested in receiving some minerals, grandfathers from you if you can send them. And I would get them. And so my grandfather would take me to mines across the southwestern part of the country. And we go to the copper mines down south, turquoise. And, they took us to the Grand Canyon. And everywhere I would go, I would get the grandfathers. And he would say, close your eyes. What do you feel? And what is the first message that comes? My grandmother did the same with plants. And we were, she was a florist. And with the teachings of my grandfather, and then I incorporated that with my grandmother, and then I became really close with flower essence remedies and how to prepare them, and where does it affect it in the body or the mind. And more so when my grandfather had a stroke, then my grandmother and I were preparing medicinal herbs and packs. And I would take them into the hospital, put warm packs on his arm that was paralyzed, massage, and talk to it. And there was a doctor that came in and said, you really ought to get a license. So I did. So I also have a massage license.
It seems like they were both very invested in traditional healing and probably also ceremony. So where do you think education came into the picture for Miguel Trujillo? What do you think sparked that for him?
I think from my grandpa, because he used to tell me little stories where when he was taken from his family home at Isleta, it was his mother, him, his sister, and half-brother. And they came around the houses to take the children to Albuquerque Indian School, not very far from here. And he remembers that he hid underneath the bed. So he wasn't taken because his mother then would only have his half-brother to help her. Well, the half-brother didn't have functional legs. I mean, he was crawling and could only use his hands. And so my grandpa knew about the hardship it would leave his mother. So he said he hid underneath the bed. Weeks later, they did another round to collect the children, and he was taken. And he told me that when he was taken, one night he snuck out and walked back to Isleta. And to imagine, possibly the fear in him and, the concern for his mother and his responsibility to garden and have that, just that care and concern. Well, they came after him and, of course, was punished. He realized then that, wait a minute, this is when education can be used as a tool to be able to speak up. So you're taking somebody else's tool and making it your own to benefit yourself and others. So that's why my grandfather always said, Karen, if you're going to get a degree, get 2 degrees. So my first degree is in nutrition, dietetics, and my second is in community health. But on top of that, I have a massage license. He said, always get a skill that nobody can take away from you. Have a skill that you really put a lot of passion to and that will thrive you beyond, because when you have a skill with that passion, it's going to make you move. It's going to have you to create. I did then, so I can rely, and to this day, I rely on all 3 of them right now. So he used education as a tool to benefit beyond. And he said he knew that at that moment and that time, it was not going to go away. We didn't have any more choices. And to this day, he's right. I mean, he's exactly right. So I think that's where he was able to use education and promote it. And then he became a principal. My grandma became a teacher. They started schools on the reservation. I was able to now see what tools they've used and how they create it. I have plays and integrating, old teachings to what they are now, and how you don't lose the old ways. Don't forget who you are, but utilize it in a good way.
Did he say how old he was when he was taken to the boarding school?
I think he was like 10, 9
Wow.
and 10, so he was old enough.
He was old enough, but still young to have that realization of education can be used as a tool to better my people.
Correct, yes. He utilized his own tool. Same thing happened with my grandmother's family, except for them, they were taken also to Carlisle.
The United States government had a policy of promoting assimilation of American Indians. One way of doing that was removing Native children from their homes and sending them to boarding school, sometimes far away from their tribes.
Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania is probably the most famous of these boarding schools. Children arrived in their traditional clothing and were immediately put into military uniforms and had their hair cut.
And my husband and I, making a trip, we stopped there and saw some burial grounds of my grandmother's sister. And I have reports of their condition. How was their physical condition and what number they were given. They were given numbers, and, they were given English names that, he always went by his Indian name. And so that's recorded on record too.
Do you know whether he enjoyed his time at boarding school or if it was difficult for him?
I know in the beginning it was difficult because, he spoke Isleta language, but he became involved later on with sports like football and boxing, and that was his outlet. He was very good. He was very short and stout. So he became friends with several of the people, and in college, it was much later on in life when he was introduced to college. In fact, he was the first Native American to graduate from the University of New Mexico. And to see his records of travel from Laguna, at that time they were residing in Laguna. Imagine it was dirt roads, and to travel and leave his family and attend school, and then being the only Native American, and then travel back and do, responsibilities to the family and the community, his job. I mean, what a man. What a man. He utilized every opportunity. That's what he did.
I want to shift a little bit to your grandmother. Can you tell us a bit more about her and what sparked her? Because it seems like she had a passion for education as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how they worked together maybe as a team?
So my grandmother, Waconda, her maiden name is Pisano, and she comes from Casablanca, which is a village in Laguna. And she had a large family. Her family owned a store, and her father and others were governors and received the cane. So she came up with a moving, prominent family. And they had received education through Carlisle. She went and she got a degree at Haskell in teaching, and she kept record of everything.
She's talking about Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, which started out as another boarding school in 1884, but today is a well-known university for Native students across the country to attend.
Like, she wrote down everything in detail. In fact, she worked for the governor of New Mexico and kept record for the governor at that time. And it became that in the home, to where organized and detailed. And my grandfather took pictures, so she organized pictures, and my grandpa would have a library, and she would, allow that to grow because she knew the importance of education and books. So they had a library in their house that they taught us how to check out books and how to do reports. And my grandmother was a writer, she would write everything down and write stories. And so they really helped each other out. What I remember of them was, beyond that education, was caring. And so at Christmas time, we would set up sacks and sacks. They had beds, and we would put them on the beds, on the floors, and everybody would get, a handful of nuts, a handful of candy, and she would keep note of who was in the nursing home and what tribe they were from. And we would stack the car up and go to the nursing homes, deliver them. We would go down to Isleta and visit all the relatives with little bags for Christmas, and then come back. So she was organizing all this, and my grandfather was helping doing all this. So she was the backbone of organization. And today it has helped me. She cooked from scratch, I'm cooking from scratch. She made her own yeast, I'm making my own yeast. I understand the importance of good health on a foundational level.
So obviously you got that from your grandma, but do you think that's also something that you learned from your mother? Can you tell us a bit about that?
My mom, Josephine. People say I sound like her and I look like her, which is a compliment. Back then it wasn't, and in fact for Halloween I would dress up like her and I look like her. I mean, she was my best friend. But my mom always had a career, and she was going to school as we were growing up. So it was my father that stayed behind to help clean up after the meals, or it was me and my sister preparing meals and washing dishes. My mother was studying. We were taken care of really well, but she was getting her nursing degree. We would go with her to classes at UNM. And John, my brother, Larry, and I, we were touring UNM, at a young age. We took swimming there, and we go to Saggio's. We go to the library. My mother was busy. However, my mother and father also had acres of garden. We raised our own cattle, chickens, pigs. We would butcher. We would put up our own food, and my grandma and grandpa would come down and help. So it was an effort. I mean, I can't imagine how my mom did all that work. And my father was the caretaker. I remember him lining our supplies up, helping us fold our PE towels and with uniforms. And at one time, my dad was a bus driver. So, going to school with my parents, and he became a PTA president. And my father, John, then was a coach. So they were always with us as we grew up. And my mother supported education. We saw it.
It's really neat. We had interviewed Gordon Bruninsky, as you know, and he talked about Josephine a lot. And he always has since the day that I've, reached out to him. He said, I promised Josephine that I would always talk about Miguel Trujillo when I could.
You'll remember Gordon from the last episode.
Here's what I want part of the record. Josephine Waconda, if you're listening, I kept my promise, and I'm still doing it. That's what I want on the record.
So it seems like Josephine and Mr. Trujillo might have had a really close bond. Would that be accurate, or do you think everybody just had a close bond?
My mother and her father, my grandpa Miguel, they really had a close bond. There's a gap in age between her and my uncle Mike. So there was a time when they had one-on-one time. They had a child before my mother, Josephine, and my grandmother gave me the picture of Edith May, and she passed at the age of 6 or 8 months, and I can't even imagine losing a child. They gave me the journal that my grandmother, she had a diary, and I purposely did not read it until just a few years ago, and just guessing what it may be. There's no doctors around. It's miles from Laguna to Albuquerque. They did everything possible, and the child passed away. So to know that grief, and I believe there was 3 to 4 years difference before they had another child. So my mom definitely was cared for. I mean, so was my uncle, but I only know the story of my mom. And I look back, and it was my mom and I that cared for my grandpa when he had a stroke. We would take turns and we would stay with my grandma, and I learned how to transport and went to PT just to know how to feed him and care for him, bathe him. And we kept him at home the best way for several years. And now I look back when I visit the burial grounds, and they're in Santa Fe, and how I feel with the loss of my parents. I can't even imagine how she felt with the loss of her father. And he passed on the day before we were told our feast, and our family were sponsors of the feast day. And I was at a big loss, but to know how close they are and to have my parents gone now, and my mother carried a lot. And I wish I was there to be her companion on a deeper level. And I was there for them. I was very close to my mom and dad and helped her with my dad. And then after that, we took a few trips. But to know how much she was going through, I wish, as a woman, as a mother, as a daughter, I wish I was there for her on a level.
And it seems as though when you're talking about your mother, I can also imagine that being the case for your grandmother. It seems like the women, traditionally and indigenous, they just carry a lot.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's amazing. So I want to talk about the case a little bit now. Did Miguel Trujillo ever talk to you about the case?
He did.
He did.
He didn't mention it much when we were really young. He started mentioning it to me when I became near the age to vote. So he walked me through. He drew out like an example of a ballot, what it's going to look like. And I spent a lot of time with them. And so in their kitchen was a TV in a sitting area, and we would watch the news, and we would watch presidential elections and also the state elections. And he would ask me to reiterate what they were saying. Like, okay, what did you hear from, this presidential speech? And we would watch these debates. We would get the newspaper, we would start reviewing it, and he would then review it with me. Say, okay, what did you learn from this? What rights are they fighting for? Is it environmental? He was into school. So anything that had somebody doing something with teachers or school boards, he made sure to pay particular attention to that. Tribal too, we had to go through the tribe. Who do you know in the tribe? And that one is a little bit more difficult because you had to know about the family. Okay, which family do they come from? And do they practice or do they believe in this? And what was their education? So he wanted us to be prepared for when it came time for us to vote. And he went with me for my first voting. He stayed there with me, and I remember it so well. And, afterwards he hugged me, and we had a special dinner, and then we stayed up late to see the elections, who won. And that was a routine. That was typical.
At the time that you went to vote, or even before when he was drawing out the ballot and everything, do you think that at your age you grasped what he had done for Native people in New Mexico?
In some sense, I did, but in a grander scale, no.
I asked that because even if they did talk about it at that age, I just feel like as a teenager, you tend to be very like, oh, okay, whatever. But it seems like he was just your whole family was just very humble about everything. So my guess is that your grandmother, Waconda, never really talked about it either much, except for when he did, maybe.
No, not at all. My grandma wasn't that boastful about it. I mean, she was true to my grandfather. Yeah. No, they didn't mention it very much.
So even though they didn't mention it, did they ever talk about maybe what they had to do or what the process was like for Trujillo v. Garley?
I can remember how much, well, my grandfather knew. He knew he was going to lose, and he knew it was going to be for a long battle. I think the hardship that I remember that struck me the most was that some of the community members at Isleta or any pueblo, in family, weren't supportive of it. They didn't want somebody to be so boastful, to go against. And a lot of the natives thought they were going to be taxed or their livelihood would be disrupted. Yes, there was a change in some sense. And you see that with any type of legal voting rights, there is a change, and you hope for it that to be a better change. But for him, he didn't know. And so how could he communicate that to others in the community or even his family members? And how do you communicate that to a system that's not aware of a system? So that's one part I remember because it hurted me to not have that support from a family or a community. I mean, how would that feel for him? So how does our family belong in this system? And how is our family looked at? I mean, this is who we are. We love one another, and we know who our cousins are, and yet grandmothers may be against that. And what were they told? So it sort of left an uncertainty in my end.
How do you think your grandmother handled all of that?
My grandmother was very quiet. She didn't have the emotional outbursts. She's a very calm woman. In fact, it was my grandma and my grandpa taught me about mindfulness practice, and I meditate, and I'm a teacher around the country about mindfulness practice, but it stemmed from them. So my grandmother, when she was cooking, she said, you be very mindful when you stir. Be very mindful when you fold the clothes. She wouldn't say the word mindful, but she would practice it and share with me. So she was very calm and nor expressed those words of hardship.
So going back to what you said about your mother, Josephine, earlier, on how much she had to carry, I imagine that your grandmother had a similar experience, but with the case. People were sometimes against Miguel Trujillo, and there was a lot of controversy. So even if you don't know from her personally, how do you think she felt in those times when either Pueblo members or family members were essentially against what your grandfather was doing?
Mm-hmm. She always came across to where you don't harbor on the negativity. And this is my mom too. You always still wish them well. Leave them in a good way. Don't carry the hardship. I come with her to problems and she said, just let it go. So as a woman and the way I am now as a mother, it's like, okay, as long as I watch my actions and do well, other people can have different perceptions and different beliefs or different attitudes. We can't control that. It is what it is. And as long as we do our own in a good way.
You make me want to cry. It seems like Miguel and Waconda were teammates essentially at the school and as teachers and educators. But when this case came around, I'm sure that they both had to put, all hands on deck. How do you think your grandma helped him behind the scenes while he was going through all of this?
Oh, I mean, she had a meal always, and they weren't just, we never had processed foods or It was a homemade meal, homemade bread. And so by having a good meal waiting for you, that's a lot. That's a lot. And by keeping track of the newspaper clippings or the court case, she wrote everything up. And so for him to come and not know what to do, the filing system, she did all that. I'm a single parent and, I'm a widow. And if somebody can file stuff for me, or I can be greeted with a home-cooked meal, oh my gosh. Even that just relieves so much. My grandpa, when I was upset, my grandpa would say, let's go. And I would go with him, and he said, okay, let's go get ice cream. And then he'll start saying, what's going on? He'll go deeper as to what's happening. He won't let things settle down and let it go. He would want to know deeper what's happening. Why is it affecting you? What are alternatives that you could do? So he was helping me problem solve within myself first, and then problem solve outwardly. Obviously this case, he had to do that. So it didn't affect him, don't act it out. Work on self first and then go beyond. They taught me how to sweep, Oh, he would mimic him sneezing. And he would say, sprinkle water, and this is how you sweep. Really feel that broom. Why do you think you're feeling that broom? I said, I don't know. It's just broom. I'm trying to get rid of this dirt. He said, no, go deeper. Picture that you're, sweeping mother's hair. That's what we do at Laguna. It's like, oh, wow. Or I'd be washing dishes. He said, oh my gosh, look at, because we would watch Lawrence Welk. He said, this is like Lawrence Welk in here. And we'd laugh. And he said, you're just going so fast. I want you to feel that movement in there and really take care. These are plates your grandma brought in. And so I would have to go slow. And to this day, I remember those stories about washing dishes. And it's a pleasure to do that. And so I've taught that to my daughter and hopefully to my granddaughter. Their teachings are multi-level layer, and it touches a core, a deep core. So when I do things, I think of him. I think of my grandma. I think of possibly his mother or what he couldn't have done for her, and later in life, what he was able to do later on.
This is reminding me, there's a quote that says, people will forget what you did, but they won't forget how they made you feel.
Yeah.
And I asked my grandma, I was like, do you know who Miguel Trujillo was? And she said, yeah, he used to visit your grandpa Ramon when he was sick in the hospital. And he would bring him something every time. And I've heard that from multiple people. So it's not only that he was an advocate for his people and a family man and an educator, but it seems like he was really involved in just community.
Yeah.
In the next episode of Encounter Culture.
It's funny, we talk about a filibuster or somebody getting up. It's a political stunt in Western democracy to stand up and talk for hours. Whereas in indigenous democratic councils, it's the norm. You might sit for days on end debating something, talking about it. Everyone says their piece. And then ultimately, when there's a consensus, people can take a decision. And it's not the will of any one person. It's a community decision.
Encounter Culture is a production of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. This season was produced in collaboration with the New Mexico History Museum with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
We are especially grateful to the family of Miguel and Waconda Trujillo and to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center.
Our show's producer is Andrea Klunder at the Creative Imposter Studios.
Season 4 is produced and edited by Alex Riegler, Monica Brain, and Andrea Klunder.
Our recording engineer is Cabby at Cabby Sound Studios in Santa Fe.
Post-production audio by Edwin R. Ruiz.
Show notes by Lisa Witter and social media design by Caitlin Sunderland.
Our executive producer is Daniel Zillman.
Thank you to New Mexico artist El Brujo de Santi Nava for our theme music, and to Clark Tinakongva, Gary Stroutzos, and Matthew Nelson for the incredible Hopi music featured throughout all 6 episodes of this season. Their new album is set to release in August 2023 and will be available for purchase on Bandcamp and at ongtupqa.com. We've included the links for you in the show notes.
For a full transcript and show notes, visit podcast.nmculture.org or click the link in the episode description in your listening app.
I'm your host, Charlotte Jusinski.
And I'm your co-host, Stephanie Padilla.
The New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs is your hub for the state's exceptional museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions.
From native treasures to space exploration, world-class folk art to awesome dinosaurs, we celebrate the essence of New Mexico every day.
Remember to head to podcast.nmculture.org/giveaway to enter to win 4 culture passes and a subscription to El Palacio. Enter before August 31st, 2023. Thanks for listening.